something changed before you ever said it out loud. You stopped reacting the way you used to. The accusation that once sent you into a long explanation suddenly felt different. The silence that once made you panic became something you could actually sit with. The sudden affection that once made you question everything no longer erased what happened before it. And perhaps the strangest part was this: you didn't become colder. You became harder to confuse. That is a very different kind of change. Because when you have spent a long time inside a confusing relationship dynamic, you learn to focus on individual moments. One argument, one accusation, one apology, one period of silence, one affectionate return, one promise that things will finally be different. Each moment feels separate, so you keep trying to understand it. Maybe they were stressed. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you were too sensitive. Maybe you really did cause the argument. Maybe the apology was sincere this time. Maybe the sudden affection meant they finally understood what they had done. And because you are focused on explaining each moment, you may never step far enough back to notice that the moments are connected. Until one day something changes. You stop asking, "What does this incident mean?" And you start asking, "Why does this keep happening?" That question can change everything, because now you are no longer studying the latest event. You are studying the pattern. And when you begin seeing a pattern, the person who once seemed impossible to understand can suddenly become much easier to understand. Not because you can read their mind, but because their behavior is no longer arriving as a series of unrelated surprises. You begin remembering the same accusation appeared before. The same silence followed another disagreement. The same affection appeared after another period of distance. The same apology created hope. And then, somehow, the same behavior returned. At first, this realization can be painful, because clarity does not always feel comforting when it exposes something you desperately wanted to believe was different. But clarity has another effect. It changes how you respond. And that is where the other person may begin noticing something about you. You are different. They may not know exactly why. They may not understand what happened inside your mind, but they can see that something which used to work no longer works in quite the same way. The accusation comes. You don't immediately defend yourself. The silence begins. You don't chase. The blame appears. You don't automatically accept it. The affection returns. You don't instantly forget everything that happened before. And suddenly, the old interaction has a problem. Your reaction is missing. That reaction may have been something they had become accustomed to. You explained, you apologized, you chased, you reassured, you tried to repair. You questioned yourself. You worked harder to make the relationship feel stable. But now, instead of automatically entering that role, you pause. You observe. And that small pause can create a much bigger psychological shift than you realize, because the old dynamic depended on predictability. A particular behavior produced a particular emotional response. An accusation produced a defense. Silence produced pursuit. Anger produced guilt. Affection produced relief. And relief often made you lower your guard again. But what happens when the sequence is interrupted? What happens when the accusation produces observation instead of panic? What happens when the silence produces patience instead of pursuit? What happens when affection produces appreciation but not immediate trust? What happens when an apology is heard but evaluated against behavior? The old formula no longer produces the old result, and that can be the first moment when the other person realizes something has changed. At first, they may assume it is temporary. Maybe you're tired, maybe you're angry, maybe you're simply having a bad day. So they try again, the familiar accusation, the familiar tone, the familiar emotional pressure, but once again, your reaction is different. And this time, they may begin paying closer attention. Not necessarily because they suddenly understand your feelings, but because they are trying to understand your behavior. Why aren't you defending yourself? Why aren't you explaining? Why aren't you chasing? Why doesn't their anger seem to create the same urgency? Why does their affection no longer erase the previous conflict? Something has changed, and eventually, the question may become much more uncomfortable. Do they understand what is happening? Because there is a major difference between someone who is emotionally exhausted and someone who has become aware. A person can become quiet because they are tired. They can create distance because they are overwhelmed. They can stop arguing because they have given up. But awareness is different. Awareness changes what you see. You begin watching the interaction instead of simply being swept away by it. You hear the accusation, but you also notice when the accusation appears. You hear the apology, but you notice what happens afterward. You experience the silence, but you remember what usually comes before it. You receive affection, but you ask whether the underlying behavior has actually changed. That is the beginning of pattern recognition, and pattern recognition is where confusion starts losing its grip. Before awareness, every event can feel like an emergency. You have to respond now. You have to explain now. You have to fix it now. You have to prove your intentions now. You have to restore peace now, because if you don't, you fear something terrible will happen. The relationship will collapse. They will leave. They will become colder. They will become angrier. They will decide that you are the problem, so you react. But once you step back, you begin noticing something important. Not every emotional storm requires your immediate participation. That realization can feel almost strange. The same person can become angry, and you can remain calm. The same silence can appear, and you can resist chasing it. The same accusation can be made, and you can refuse to spend hours proving yourself. The same affection can return, and you can allow yourself to enjoy the moment without using it as evidence that everything is suddenly healed. You are still feeling, but you are no longer automatically obeying every feeling. And that is the difference between emotional reaction and emotional awareness. You can feel something without immediately acting on it. You can miss someone without returning to the same dynamic. You can feel guilty without automatically accepting responsibility. You can feel compassion without abandoning your boundaries. You can love someone without allowing their behavior to define your worth. This is when the meaning of seeing through them becomes much deeper. It does not mean you discovered every secret. It does not mean you know every motive. it does not mean you can predict every future action. It means you have stopped evaluating the relationship only through what is being said in the current moment. You are looking at the whole picture. You are comparing words with behavior, promises with consistency, apologies with change, affection with accountability, and suddenly, one beautiful moment cannot erase months of painful patterns. One terrible argument cannot erase months of kindness either. You begin looking at the relationship as a whole. That is discernment. And discernment can feel threatening to a dynamic that once depended on confusion. Because confusion keeps you asking questions that can never seem to end. Did I misunderstand? Was I too sensitive? Did I make them behave that way? Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe if I explain myself better, they will finally understand. Those questions keep your attention trapped inside the latest incident. Part recognition moves your attention somewhere else. Instead of asking only what happened, you begin asking what keeps happening. Instead of asking why they are angry today, you begin asking why anger repeatedly appears in similar situations. Instead of asking why they suddenly became affectionate, you begin asking what usually happens after that affection. Instead of asking whether their apology sounds convincing, you begin asking whether the behavior changes. And that is where something powerful happens. You stop allowing words to stand alone. You place them inside context. Context changes everything. A promise means something different when you have seen promises followed by the same behavior. An apology means something different when there is no lasting change. Affection means something different when it repeatedly appears after emotional distance. Silence means something different when you have learned not to automatically interpret it as proof that you are guilty. You are not becoming cynical. You are becoming observant. And the difference matters because cynicism says, everyone is going to hurt me. Awareness says, I will pay attention to what actually happens. That is a healthier form of power. You don't need to assume the worst. You simply stop ignoring what the pattern is showing you, and eventually, the person on the other side may notice that you are no longer participating in the old emotional sequence. They accuse, you observe. They withdraw, you allow space. They return with affection, you listen. They apologize, you watch what happens next. They become angry. You do not automatically become guilty. And perhaps this is where they begin to realize, you saw it, you understood it. You may not have every detail, but you understand enough. Enough to recognize the pattern, enough to recognize the sequence, enough to recognize when words are being used to redirect attention, enough to recognize when your emotional reaction is becoming the focus instead of the original issue, enough to recognize that intensity does not automatically equal truth. And once you understand that, their emotional behavior loses something, not all of its emotional impact, but some of its authority. They can still make you sad. They can still disappoint you. They can still hurt you. But they no longer automatically get to decide what their behavior means. That distinction is enormous. Someone can say, "You're the reason I'm angry." You can hear it without automatically deciding that you are guilty. Someone can become silent. You can notice the silence without assuming you must chase them. Someone can suddenly become affectionate. You can appreciate the affection without deciding that the entire pattern has disappeared. Someone can apologize. You can accept the apology without assuming that an apology is the same thing as transformation. You are separating the event from the interpretation. And that is exactly where your independence begins, because for a long time, someone else's emotional state may have become the atmosphere of your entire world. If they were happy, you could relax. If they were angry, you became anxious. If they were distant, you tried to repair the connection. If they were affectionate, you felt relief. Your peace became connected to their behavior, but awareness begins breaking that connection. Their mood can belong to them. Their interpretation can belong to them. Their anger can belong to them. Their disappointment can belong to them. And you can still care without taking ownership of emotions that are not yours. That is not cruelty. That is emotional responsibility. You begin realizing that you are responsible for your behavior, your choices, your boundaries, and your responses. You are not automatically responsible for regulating another adult's emotions. And once you understand that, something inside you becomes quieter. You no longer feel the same urgency to fix everything. You no longer believe every uncomfortable moment must be resolved immediately. You no longer need every misunderstanding corrected. You no longer need to convince someone that you are a good person. You begin realizing that someone who is committed to misunderstanding, you cannot always be convinced by a better explanation. And this is where the old dynamic begins losing another layer of power. Because over-explaining can become a trap. You think you are clarifying, but sometimes, the more you explain, the more material there is to argue about. You explain your intention. They challenge your intention. You explain your memory. They challenge your memory. You explain your feelings. They challenge your feelings, and suddenly, you are no longer discussing what happened. You are defending your right to experience what happened. Awareness interrupts that. You begin realizing, I don't have to convince you that my experience is real. That sentence can represent years of growth, because closure does not always come from the other person's agreement. Sometimes closure comes from your own understanding. You may never receive the perfect apology. You may never hear the exact words you wanted. You may never get a complete explanation. You may never have every question answered, but you can still know what you experienced. You can still recognize repeated behavior. You can still decide what you will accept in the future. And that is why seeing through someone does not have to end with confrontation. You don't necessarily need a dramatic speech. You don't need to announce, I know exactly what you're doing. You don't need to expose every contradiction. You don't need to win the final argument. Sometimes the clearest evidence that you understand is that you stop entering the same argument. You stop explaining yourself for the 100th time. You stop chasing every silence. You stop treating every affectionate moment as proof of change. You stop allowing guilt to make decisions for you. You stop trying to force someone to see what they have repeatedly refused to see. And that is when your behavior becomes the message, your silence says something, your boundaries say something, your patience says something. Your refusal to react automatically says something. Not, I hate you, but I understand myself now. That is a much deeper transformation. Because perhaps the person they once influenced was not weak. Perhaps that person was simply confused. There is a difference. Confusion can make intelligent people doubt themselves. Confusion can make loving people overgive. Confusion can make patient people tolerate too much. Confusion can make compassionate people take responsibility for things that were never theirs. But once confusion begins disappearing, the same person can look completely different, not because their personality changed, because their perception changed, and perception changes behavior. This is why the real shift in the relationship may have happened before you ever announced it. It happened when you stopped seeing each event as an isolated emergency. It happened when you started connecting the dots. It happened when you stopped asking, "How do I make this person understand me?" and started asking, "What is this situation teaching me?" That question changes your position. You are no longer trying only to survive the interaction, you are learning from it. And when you learn from repetition, you become less vulnerable to surprise. The same tactic may still hurt, but it doesn't shock you in the same way. The same accusation may still be painful, but it doesn't automatically define you. The same withdrawal may still feel sad, but it doesn't automatically send you running after them. The same affection may still touch your heart, but it doesn't automatically rewrite your memory. That is what awareness looks like, not becoming emotionless, becoming harder to manipulate through emotional confusion. And perhaps that is the moment they realize you saw through them. Not when you say it, not when you confront them, not when you explain the entire pattern, but when they repeat something that once worked, and it doesn't work the same way anymore. That is the moment the old dynamic begins revealing itself. They may try a different approach, then another. The tone may change, the story may change, the emotional intensity may change, but underneath it, you recognize something familiar. And because you recognize it, you do not have to react to every new version as though it is a completely new situation. You have context now, and context protects you from confusion. This is where the power shift becomes real. They may still have words, they may still have emotions. They may still have the ability to influence how you feel in a particular moment, but they no longer automatically control what those feelings mean. You can feel guilty and still ask whether the guilt belongs to you. You can feel afraid and still ask whether there is actually something you need to fear. You can feel lonely and still refuse to return to something that repeatedly harmed your peace. You can feel love and still choose a boundary. That is emotional independence. And emotional independence is not the absence of attachment. It is the ability to remain connected to yourself even when someone else is trying to pull you emotionally in another direction. You begin trusting your observations. You begin trusting consistency. You begin trusting your ability to pause. And perhaps most importantly, you begin trusting yourself again. Because self-trust is often what confusion slowly damages. You start wondering whether your memory is accurate, whether your feelings are valid, whether your boundaries are reasonable, whether you are asking for too much, whether you are the difficult one, whether you should just try harder. But awareness begins rebuilding that internal trust, not by convincing yourself that you are always right, but by becoming willing to look honestly at what is happening. You can admit when you made a mistake. You can apologize when you were wrong. You can take responsibility for your own behavior. But you no longer accept responsibility simply because someone is angry with you. That is an important distinction. Healthy accountability says, I did something wrong, and I can correct it. Manipulation says, you feel bad, therefore I must be wrong. Those are not the same thing. Awareness teaches you to separate them. And once you can separate them, you become much harder to control through guilt. The same thing happens with affection. Affection can be genuine. A person can care about you and still behave in unhealthy ways. A beautiful moment can be real and still not prove that the entire relationship is healthy. That is why awareness does not require you to deny the good. You can admit that there were beautiful memories. You can admit that you loved them. You can admit that they made you happy sometimes. You can admit that you wanted the relationship to work and still recognize that the overall pattern was damaging. You don't have to turn someone into a monster to justify protecting yourself. That may be one of the most mature realizations in the entire process. You can understand someone without excusing them. You can forgive without reopening the same door. You can care without giving unlimited access. You can wish someone well without returning to the same cycle. And eventually, you stop needing to prove that your decision is justified because the decision is yours. That is what emotional independence ultimately gives you. Choice, not the ability to control another person, the ability to choose your response. You cannot control whether someone becomes angry, but you can choose whether you enter the argument. You cannot control whether someone misunderstands you, but you can choose whether you spend hours proving yourself. You cannot control whether someone withdraws, but you can choose whether you chase. You cannot control whether someone apologizes, but you can choose whether you trust their behavior again. You cannot control whether someone changes, but you can choose what you will accept while they remain the same. That is where the center of your life begins moving back to you. And perhaps this is what the other person eventually notices. You are no longer waiting for them to give you permission to trust yourself. You are no longer waiting for their apology before you allow yourself to move forward. You are no longer waiting for their approval before you believe you have value. You are no longer waiting for their mood to determine whether you are allowed to feel peaceful. Something has returned to you. Your own judgment, your own perspective, your own boundaries, your own ability to choose. And once those things return, the old relationship dynamic cannot function exactly as it did before. Because the person they once knew how to influence through confusion is changing. Not into someone cruel, not into someone heartless, not into someone obsessed with revenge, into someone clear. And clarity is quiet. It does not need to announce itself. It does not need an audience. It does not need the other person to agree. It simply changes what you are willing to participate in. That is why the deepest answer to the title is not that the narcissist suddenly became afraid because you discovered every hidden secret. The deeper answer is much more subtle. They realized that you were no longer looking at them through the confusion that once surrounded the relationship. You were looking at the pattern, and once you saw the pattern, the next repetition could not have the same power. The same words could be spoken. The same silence could appear, the same affection could return, the same accusation could be made. But now there was something different standing between their behavior and your reaction. Awareness, you had context, you had memory, you had observation, and you had begun trusting yourself. That is why they may have thought you were becoming distant. But distance was not the real story. You were becoming aware. And awareness changed the meaning of everything. You were not becoming cold. You were becoming clear. You were not becoming heartless. You were becoming emotionally independent. You were not necessarily losing your ability to love. You were losing your willingness to abandon yourself just to keep someone else comfortable, and that is the transformation that matters. Because they did not lose influence simply because you fought back. They lost the old influence because you stopped needing them to explain reality to you. You no longer needed them to tell you whether you were hurt. You no longer needed them to confirm whether the pattern existed. You no longer needed them to agree with your memory. You no longer needed their confession before trusting your own experience. You could observe, you could evaluate. You could decide. And that is freedom. Not making them regret losing you, not winning the final argument, not proving that you were right. Just reaching the point where their emotional reaction no longer has automatic authority over your reality. They can still speak. They can still accuse. They can still withdraw. They can still return. They can still become affectionate, but you are no longer standing where you used to stand. You are not waiting for every emotional storm to tell you what to do. You are not treating every accusation as a verdict. You are not treating every silence as a command. You are not treating every apology as proof. You are not treating every affectionate moment as evidence that the pattern has disappeared. You are watching. You are remembering. You are choosing. And perhaps that is what really happened when the narcissist realized you saw through them. You didn't suddenly become stronger than them. You didn't suddenly stop caring. You didn't discover every secret. You simply became harder to confuse. And when confusion loses its power, the old dynamic begins to lose its foundation, because awareness changes perception. Perception changes response. Response changes the dynamic. And the dynamic eventually changes what you are willing to accept. So, if you ever wonder what they realized when they looked at you and sensed something was different, remember this: they may not have realized that you knew everything. They may have realized that you knew enough to stop reacting automatically, enough to recognize repetition, enough to separate words from behavior, enough to understand that affection does not automatically equal change, enough to understand that anger does not automatically equal truth, enough to understand that guilt does not automatically equal responsibility, enough to understand that silence does not automatically create an obligation to chase, and enough to understand that your peace cannot depend on another person's emotional state. That is why the old version of the relationship could no longer continue in exactly the same way. Because the person who once experienced every moment from inside the confusion had finally stepped back far enough to see the whole picture. And once you see the whole picture, you cannot force yourself to see only one piece again. You may still hurt. You may still miss them. You may still remember the good. You may still wish things had turned out differently, but you know what you know, and you no longer need another person to validate it before you are allowed to move forward. They thought you were becoming distant, but you were becoming aware. And once you finally knew what you were looking at, you could no longer unknow.